Good morning, everybody. I hope you hear me. Dr. Nick, nice seeing you. Yes. So I think we should get started. The other people will join us as we progress. We don't want to lose any more time. I hope it is okay from you, Nick.
Yes, yeah, ready to start anytime. Thank you.
Gentlemen, let me welcome you to the 6th webinar organized by the Water Resources Institute. Are you hearing me, Nick?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yes, can we start, or you are waiting for somebody from your side to join, or we can go ahead and start?
We can start. Thank you.
Okay, fine then. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start. I welcome you to the 6th webinar for the Water Resources Institute. This webinar is organized collaboratively by the Water Resources Institute of the Ministry of Water and Environment, together with Africa Climate Mobility Initiative under the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And for this webinar, we are going to be listening to a talk by Dr. Nick Simpson, who is the Senior Advisor to the Global Center for Climate Mobility and an expert in this area, leading the program in Africa. And he will be talking to us about current realities of climate-forced migration in Africa and possible scenarios for future migration and displacement resulting from increasing climate. As we always do, we have brief remarks, maybe Nick from your side or any of your colleagues before you come in with the presentation. Then after the presentation, we'll have some time for questions before we close. This webinar runs from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. You don't have to use all that time, but you have that time available. So after the presentation, we'll allow as much time as possible for questions. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Again, for those who are joining for the first time, we started these monthly webinars in December, and these webinars are held every last Friday of the month from 11 to 1 p.m. We do call upon partners that would want to share the work they are doing with the rest of the world. We have participants from within Uganda and outside. Reach out to us so that we can share them. We do believe that this provides us an opportunity for us to get new information, learn on what is happening in Africa and globally, also be able to create linkages. Feel free to post information in the chat room so that we can respond. Nick and the colleagues will be online, so when you post, they will be able to respond as in the presentation and discussions are going on. Otherwise, Nick, thank you very much. Let me invite you or one of your colleagues to make some remarks, and immediately after that, you can start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalis, and thank you so much for inviting us to share our work here. I would like to say on behalf of the Global Center for Climate Mobility that it's a real wonderful opportunity for us to share the work that we've managed to publish in the African Shifts report. And we look forward to working with the government of Uganda going forward on a planned climate mobility deep dive, which I will speak to in this session. And so I think without too much more ado, I'll just get straight into my presentation if that's okay. I think it would make sense for me to split the presentation in two so that we can have some robust questions and answers on the African Shifts report itself. And I'd love to invite any reflection, insights from those attending on what our report says of the current realities and the future projections of climate mobility for Africa. And then in the second half of today's session, I'd like to present our planned deep dive program for multiple countries, cities, and regions of the continent, and narrow in on our plans to work with the government of Uganda on a Uganda climate mobility deep dive. So to kick it off, just to say thank you to our funders, sponsors of this project over the last few years. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So to put you in the picture, the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative was launched in September 2021 as a joint undertaking of the Africa Union Commission, the World Bank, and the United Nations. It aims to generate a common policy agenda, political momentum, and resources to advance comprehensive, evidence-based, people-centered, and community-led solutions for climate mobility in Africa. The first phase of the ACMI focused on data collection, modeling projections, and multi-sector analysis. This included 9 months of rigorous consultations with African and global stakeholders that saw the emergence of a community of practice for the continent, and the publication of the African Shifts Report, the Africa Climate Mobility Report addressing climate-forced migration and displacement. Over 2023 and 2024, the ACMI will advance this knowledge, policy, and practice on climate mobility to enable its partners and frontline communities to anticipate and plan for climate mobility, transform development, and build adaptation strategies to promote people-positive adaptation and prevent loss and damage from climate change. This will be achieved through its core areas of work, including through its flagship projects on climate literacy, water solutions, and green skills, and through country deep dives, as will be explained in the second half of this presentation. The African Shifts Report documents the current realities of climate-forced migration in Africa and possible scenarios for future climate displacement. It makes the case for integrating advanced planning for climate mobility into Africa's strategies for climate change adaptation and climate resilient development. It also provides research, data, and projections to inform anticipatory actions, policy planning, and political cooperation in support of locally anchored solutions for adaptation and resilience. The report is split into 3 sections: current realities, future projections, and an agenda for action. Africa is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. Despite contributing little to the cause of climate change, the continent faces an urgent climate adaptation challenge to reduce the vulnerability of its populations, strengthen the resilience of its people and communities. Key development sectors across the continent have already experienced widespread losses and damages due to climate change, including water shortages, biodiversity loss, decreasing food production, loss of lives, and reduced economic growth. The current trajectory in global emissions leads to increasingly severe extreme heat, drought, flooding, and coastal erosion, which will undermine livelihoods and make parts of the continent less habitable in coming decades. Deteriorating living conditions may eventually force people to abandon areas where climate impacts are no longer tolerable. If unplanned and poorly managed, such movements risk adding stress in already fragile places, potentially heightening tensions around land and water resources, Sudden and large population shifts affecting African cities could undermine planning efforts and social cohesion. Yet, a potentially worse outcome would see people stranded in place as a result of poverty, age, disability, gender, legal barriers, leaving them highly exposed to and vulnerable to increasingly hazardous climate conditions. For people facing climate stresses across the continent, we found climate mobility is likely to be a response of last resort. Across the ACMI case studies, the vast majority of people want to stay in their home communities, whether voluntary or involuntary. Most Africans are attached to their land and homes, their heritage, and don't aspire to leave their communities. Even though they suffer from climate disruptions, they don't consider moving. 23% of our survey respondents indicated that they lack the means to move, even if they wanted to. The communities surveyed understood successful adaptation for them as finding a way to stay where they live. This stands in contrast to the global discourse on migration in Africa, which positions mobility as the immediate response to climate impact on African communities. For those compelled to move due to climate impacts, relocation is often too costly. As a result, people remain in place at risk of being forced to evacuate in worse circumstances or becoming stranded. Many people forcibly displaced by extreme and sudden climate shocks return home, and their livelihoods depend on that place of origin. Others settle in new locations where they may remain vulnerable and exposed due to what they lost in moving. Hence, unplanned climate mobility can result in new risks and new vulnerabilities. Understanding the differential impact of climate change on women, children, and the elderly is critically important. For example, it's common for women to stay behind when men migrate, and this often comes with additional burdens that can be aggravated by climate stresses. Forced displacement leaves women and girls disproportionately vulnerable. When women are displaced, they are at greater risk of violence, including sexual violence. Most people on the continent move to seek better opportunities, particularly after sudden loss of income sources. In areas that have been hit by extreme weather events, climate risks feature more prominently in people's decisions to move. But women indicate a greater reluctance to move than men, as indicated in this chart here. But the vulnerability of women is also highlighted by the fact that national average climate change literacy rates for women are 12.8% lower than men. But for both men and women across the continent, there is widespread lack of knowledge about the connections between climate change and its impact on livelihoods, on careers, on business choices. So current coping responses are therefore unlikely to prove sustainable. People are deciding to stay or move without adequate information on the risks of remaining in place or the risks associated with relocation. Raising climate change literacy rates across the continent would allow people to make safer and more informed choices when addressing climate risks. I'll now speak to the future projections of climate mobility in the African Shifts report. The ACMI modeled 4 possible scenarios for future climate mobility in Africa. The model includes climate impacts on water availability, crop production, net primary productivity as an indicator to gauge conditions in rangelands, food risk, sea level rise, and heavy rainfall associated with tropical cyclones. In doing so, the model draws on the actual impacts on critical primary sectors such as water, agriculture, and ecosystem services, all of which are central to a range of livelihoods and people's choices whether to stay or move. Beyond climate impacts, other factors such as armed conflict are also considered when projecting population shifts out of the affected areas and towards more favorable environments. This model marks a significant technical advance compared to previous methods used to project climate mobility for Africa. And it is modeled at greater time and space increments than has previously been done. The first set of scenarios across the bottom of this figure assumes a low emissions future in line with the Paris Agreement goals, combined with 2 different possible development trajectories and inequitable, bottom right, versus inclusive, bottom left, development futures. The second set of scenarios assumes a continuation of the current trajectory of high emissions based on the currently limited progress on the necessary rapid reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the near term. These are combined with the same 2 possible inequitable versus equitable development futures. The choice of a high road and a rocky road scenario is well supported by the most recent IPCC synthesis report that shows how far off the target we are from the kind of immediate, rapid, and widespread reduction in greenhouse gas emissions necessary to limit warming to 1.5 or below 2 degrees Celsius. It's also well supported by the synthesis report caution on increased risk, particularly for vulnerable regions like Africa, even at intermediate emissions futures within our lifetime. So in light of rising emissions, despite the Paris Agreement, the report prioritized the high emissions scenarios to discuss likely future climate mobility projections in the near term for Africa, to provide actionable information for decision making. The rocky road scenario in orange and on the right is a scenario of high greenhouse gas emissions, where the planet heats to at least 2 degrees Celsius by mid-century. Africa sees low development progress with low levels of international cooperation, high population growth, a lower rate of urbanization than in the high road scenario, low GDP and low education progress. But importantly, and we make many recommendations that are linked to the development future that is characterized by the high road scenario, shown in green and on the left. This is a future of high emissions, but in a future where policies and development choices guide Africa to a more inclusive development future, a lower population growth, a rapid but well-planned urbanization, medium GDP, and higher progress on both education and health outcomes. As Africa's population grows and climate impacts intensify, climate mobility is expected to increase. More severe climate disruptions combined with Africa's growing population are forecast to propel increasing movement within countries in coming decades. By 2050, up to 5% of Africa's population Some 2 billion people could be on the move due to climate impacts. That's up from 1.5% today. The overwhelming majority of this movement will be within countries rather than across borders. By mid-century, under the Rocky Road scenario, so that is high emissions and inequitable development, internal climate mobility is projected to reach 88 million people and could reach as high as 113 million by 2050. But the high road scenario, which is a more inclusive development future, will see approximately 70 million people forecast to move due to climate impacts. Future projections of internal climate mobility compared between these two scenarios shows that by pursuing a more inclusive development path in line with Africa's ambitions, the continent can mitigate some of the harmful effects of high emissions futures and significantly lower climate-forced migration and displacement in coming decades. While Africa has little influence over the near-term reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it can protect its people and lead by example by taking a greener, more inclusive development path, by addressing vulnerability and anticipating and planning for climate mobility. Cross-border climate mobility is forecast to reach a maximum of 1.2 million people by 2050 under the high road scenario. Climate mobility may contribute up to 10% of all cross-border migration by 2050. Most cross-border movement will be in Southern Africa, where mobility between neighboring countries is forecast to increase due to favorable climate impacts on crop yields that could enable people to undertake longer journeys. Hotspot areas of internal climate mobility, where a high concentration of in and out mobility will take place, emerge across the continent as early as 2030. This map shows the hotspots at 2050, where people are projected to move towards areas where climate conditions are forecast to be relatively better. Borderlands emerge as climate mobility hotspots, such as between Niger and Nigeria, around Lake Victoria, and in the Horn of Africa. The impact of climate change and climate mobility itself will be unequally distributed across Africa. The most affected region will be the Intergovernmental Authority for Development region, the IGAD region, where up to 10.5% of the population, or 55 million people, could be on the move by 2050 under the Rocky Road scenario. Borderlands around the Rift Valley are projected to become major climate mobility hotspots. Rwanda's border area with Uganda could see up to 1 million new arrivals by 2050. However, particular locations within the same area will see incoming mobility of comparable magnitude, showing that these areas will see significant change and flux of their population. The future is particularly uncertain in highland rain-fed agriculture areas, where increases in internal migration may slow for both scenarios and even reverse by 2030 under the high road scenario. This is because changes in water availability and crop yields will be main drivers of climate mobility for rain-fed agriculture. When people move between rural areas, it will mostly be when climate impacts have disrupted water availability, inducing people to search for new livelihood opportunities. While internal climate mobility will generally contribute to urban growth, it could also be a major driver of population decline in some cities. In the north and east of the continent. Africa's rapidly growing cities will be hotspots for climate risk as they experience compounding shocks from extreme events. They will damage human settlements and critical infrastructure. Populations in rapidly urbanizing areas, especially in informal settlements, are particularly affected by extreme heat, flooding, extreme rainfall, sea level rise, and erosion. All of this knowledge and data on the current realities and future projections of climate mobility for Africa are synthesized with the latest understandings of adaptation planning for policy recommendations in the African Shift Agenda for Action. By preparing its people and institutions and investing in resilience, Africa can harness climate mobility to help communities and countries adapt and prevent loss and damage from climate change. Harnessing climate mobility could also prove a unique opportunity to consolidate regional integration, drive development under more severe climate conditions, and further common growth on the continent. The African Shifts report makes the case for integrating advanced planning for climate mobility into strategies for climate change adaptation and development planning. It includes an 8-point agenda for action to inform anticipatory actions, policy planning, and political cooperation in support of locally anchored solutions for adaptation and resilience in affected communities. Action 1 is to anticipate and plan for climate-forced displacement and migration, including permanent relocation, to foster social cohesion in affected communities, prevent immobility, drive economic growth, sustain peace, and protect people on the move. Action 2 includes recommendations around integrating climate mobility in climate adaptation and finance commitments. It recognizes and supports mobility as a legitimate strategy for climate adaptation at local, national, and regional levels, and the importance of building cross-sector partnerships to support people and communities staying, moving, and receiving newcomers. Actions 3 to 5 center on empowerment, enhancing public understanding of climate risk and threats, including through building climate literacy, the co-production of actionable climate information, and access to early warnings to support informed decisions on how to adapt, whether and when to move, and where to settle. Action 4 focuses on empowerment of women, empowering women with climate information, adaptive skills, social and legal protection to bolster their agency and decisions on climate adaptation and in climate mobility. Action 5 focuses on the need to foster and leverage the creativity and potential of Africa's already mobile youth to build resilience and economic prosperity, and to advance the green transition. Actions 6 to 8 focus on transforming development in the kind of inclusive ways that the high road scenario epitomizes. So pursuing community-led solutions for climate resilient development, disaster response, and climate mobility across the continent requires an investment in locally anchored climate adaptation and resilience pathways, including strong connections in border areas. Investing in resilient and connected cities will enable cities with actionable data, resources, and agency to facilitate planned, resilient, and inclusive urban growth, social cohesion, and social protection, while building stronger ties across cities and with rural areas. Finally, Action 8 focuses on the need to pursue nature-positive development through managing land, water, and other shared natural resources cooperatively and sustainably, to support agricultural and ecosystem-based livelihoods, while reducing the environmental impact and harnessing ecosystem biodiversity for economic development and climate resilience. Over the last 25 minutes, I've presented the findings of the African Shifts Report, which documents the current realities and future projections of climate mobility. And I would like to pause now to take some questions before the second section, where I will provide an overview of our planned country deep dives that will translate this knowledge to practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick, for the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the report and its key findings and recommendations. I think what is clear is that there will be climate-forced migration and displacement, and there are a number of factors that are causing this. Internal migration and also migration across borders, and also the impacts, and also the various hotspot areas where we shall have climate mobility happening most. Cities have been highlighted. The 8-point agenda has been highlighted. So we open the floor for comments, and you can put up your hands. I already see John Mary. Can you come forward and raise your comment? You can take a few, and then Nick will be able to respond. So over to you, John Mary.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, Simpson, for the presentation. My concern is that you've given us very nice.
Would it be possible that, John, you introduce yourself so that you know where you are calling from?
Okay. My name is John Mary Odoy, and I'm a climate activist. Formerly, I used to be the chair of Climate Action Network in Uganda. I would like to say this is a very nice presentation, but I'm concerned about the interventions that are being planned, how they are going to be well spread and implemented in the different maybe countries, if I may say so, because I know that the level of appreciation of issues of climate change, the climate crisis, is different from different countries. And so I don't know whether there's a way that all these nice suggestions, there's going to be a way of harmonizing of how this can be done, because I know that the migrations are going to affect all the countries. So what's the plan that is there that's going to allow people moving from one city to another, maybe from one border to another? I see a lot of conflicts and violence that's going to happen during the course of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John Mary. We take a few more. Christopher Bendana, over to you. Introduce yourself and raise your question.
Mr. Simpson, thank you for your presentation. My name is Christopher Benana. I'm a freelance science writer based here in Kampala. I have two questions. The first one is, I found when you were presenting a slide on...
Christopher seems to be losing you. Your network seems not to be stable.
I'm close to my computer. Can you hear me now?
You can try and see whether it gets clearer. Okay, go
yes,
ahead.
I found when Mr. Simpson was presenting on the climate literacy rates, and I'm wondering, I saw that the rates were low. Whom, like in terms of our awareness, whom should we target most? The policymakers, the farmers, MPs, like which group do you think will have the greatest impact on adaptation? And the second and last one, in terms, if you said something about IGAD, that more migration would take like in IGAD countries. If you're a policymaker or a leader in one of the countries of IGAD, which focus area would you invest more to see that these internal and external migrations are limited?
Okay, thank you very much for the comment. I hope Dr. Nick, you have taken note. We get Ambrose online. Take the floor, Ambrose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nick. My name is Ambrose Tolit. I am the Executive Director of Grassroots Alliance for Rural Development. We are based in Karamoja. In fact, what you have presented, we have experienced, and my attention is drawn to your snapshot on women have indicated a greater reluctance to migrate. I was interested to understand more deeply because one, recent scenarios in the Karamoja cluster. By Karamoja cluster, I mean that link of Turkana, the Karamoja of Uganda, the Pokot, and you get South Sudan clusters. So what we have experienced is you see most time women are the ones who move a lot in search of opportunities. You have also seen, we have noted cases of migrations, but much as it is women, it is again aggregated in terms of the age. And you look at the young are always very adventurous, especially the female. But you find that most of these are limited. So you find that when women with a limited capacity in terms of skill, in terms of physical strengths, they always don't move. So I wanted to understand, is this specific to a particular area, or it is a generic findings that you have got? And then the other thing that I also wanted to find out is the link of migration and natural resources. There are other areas that are endowed with natural resources. And you find that with the influence of the neoliberals, especially the miners, the speculators, so you find that there is that induced migration, because if you look at some of these belts, you find that there is an interaction between climate change. You get the issues of conflict as well there, which is as a result of natural resources or any other resources. So please, that is what I wanted to understand a deeper little bit. Thank you.
Hi, Rose. I think we could take one more if you want to give your question. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Because I didn't hear the moderator saying. So thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick, for the presentation. I came in a little bit later when you had already reached some points. I think actually my questions are more related to what Ambrose and the previous speaker said. It's something I've been wanting to ask you about, even at a bilateral level, on the issue of literacy levels. Because I see, for example, I don't remember the number. Was it 62 in Uganda? Something like that. And for me, I feel like if you could show the context, because we've seen other research before that puts it much lower than that, at 20%, at 30%. And then, but making it general, it looks like, 62% is quite a good number. I don't think even the developed countries have that yet. So I think, that is one thing I've been thinking about, maybe making it more specific to the context you are looking at. If you looked at maybe online and making it more specific to that than generalizing and making it look like this the country level aspect. The other thing I was also thinking is like, again, on the migration, women staying back. I think when you look at other aspects, for example, with the labor mobility program, I don't know if I should call it program, between Uganda and Saudi Arabia, we find more girls going to those areas. Again, it goes back to the context. I think for some contexts, women may stay. For other contexts, I mean, women and girls may move more than the men. Then I was also thinking, like, we all know that migration and human mobility is part and parcel of human life. We've moved, our ancestors have moved a lot, and whether it's a stress on climate or conflict. I don't know if, I know that the report is so big, I've looked at it, but haven't really gone even a quarter of it. But I was just wondering the intersection between the climate stressor and other stressors, because sometimes it's very hard to put a tag that this person moved because of climate change. It could be because they had land when, I mean, the land was sold, and then because they were paying school fees, and now they can't, agriculture isn't more productive because they have a small piece of land. So how are you tagging the climate stressor to the human mobility? I know that is the same question I've been asking myself. In some cases, such as rapid onset, it's very clear. People are displaced by floods. You can see that they're displaced, they're in IDPs, and it's very clear. But for slow onsets, how could we try to zero down, or maybe try to communicate the multiple stressors and also bring in the aspect of the climate? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Rose. Let's get Oscar, and then after that, Nick, you can respond. So Oscar, over to you. Oscar, I don't know, is everybody hearing you? Could it be my network that is having a problem? Nick, are you hearing Oscar?
No, I'm not hearing Oscar.
Okay, so Oscar, we seem not hear you. Nick, maybe you can respond to these, and then we see.
Also, Doctor, there are some questions in the chat.
Okay, so yes, thank you very much, Robert. So Nick, you can respond to those questions that have been raised and those that have been posted in the chat. And then after that, we decide now we proceed. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful range of questions that really engage with the heart and the purpose of this work. So yeah, I hope I do them justice in my response. So firstly, to respond to John Mary O'Dowd, how will this play out across different contexts in implementing adaptation? Yeah, that is our current focus of work from 2023 to 2024, where we are drawing on the findings of the African Shifts report, the multiple, over 100 consultations that went into interpreting and understanding those findings, both through quantitative projections as well as qualitative case study work, and then engaging with policymakers from across the continent. We're taking all of that into what we call deep dives. And in my next presentation, which will be about a 15-minute overview of country, city, and regional deep dives, I'll give some explanation on the planning process towards that. But just to quickly respond to the specificity of your question, key to that process is working with local, national, city partners to help them interpret these projections for climate mobility and integrate them with their own development planning. It doesn't make sense to have these broad brush continental projections without downscaling them adequately. Fortunately, in our case, this model was run for every 5-kilometer pixel on the continent. Okay, so we have a projection of climate impacts on every 5 kilometers and for every 5-year time increment from 2020 to 2050. So, for example, a city planner can make use of that knowledge by comparing their projections of population growth for their city, whether it's a large or a small city, and our projections for population change as a result of climate mobility. And that could help them anticipate for climate mobility better, because for some cities, we are projecting over 20% change, either increase or decrease of the total population of that city. And for many cities, it's not the total number of population that they have, but the percentage change that really affects their service delivery, as well as their revenue collections for a sustainable municipal finance. So yeah, that'll be answered in quite a lot of detail for the next 15 minutes in the deep dive overview. But thanks for that question, John. Then on to Christopher, who asked about climate literacy rates. Who should we target the most? I've done a lot of thinking on this since we published the first paper on climate change literacy for Africa 18 months ago. In that paper, we drew on the Afrobarometer survey, which is a nationally representative survey of 33 African countries and represents about 61% of Africa's total population. It gives us a pretty good idea, particularly at national and region 1, so sub-national, provincial level, climate change literacy rates for the continent. In that research, we found that the largest predictor of climate literacy on the continent is attainment of tertiary education. Those with only primary education were much less likely to be climate literate. And of course, those without education, much less likely. But there's also important demographic and socioeconomic profiles. As I mentioned, on average, women are 12.8% less likely to be climate literate than men at a national average. But that varies greatly between countries. And some countries it's larger, some are smaller. In countries where it is smaller, it's generally because the male climate change literacy rate is also particularly low for that country. So who should we target? Working on that survey, it shows that we should target young girls in Africa, particularly at their high school and junior school education levels. It also means that we should target older populations that never had a chance to be educated and yet are in their livelihood exposed to climate change. It also showed that poverty undermines climate literacy. So interventions that reduce poverty should be cognizant of the need to have co-benefits for building an understanding of climate risk. But your question was very insightful, because I think boosting climate literacy on the continent needs to go beyond simply integrating climate understanding in school curriculum, because we need decision makers to have higher climate literacy. And one of the biggest problems globally is poor climate literacy amongst very influential political and administrative decision makers. So we need to have programs such as the one developed by UNEP a few years ago that targets boosting climate literacy for magistrates on the continent, because they are anticipating an increased litigation on climate issues for magistrates and judges over the next 20 to 30 years because of the loss and damage caused by climate change. Your second question, Christopher, that looked at the IGAD region, which focus areas should receive the most investment to manage climate mobility. I hope to answer that a little bit more effectively in the following presentation on the deep dives, where we will be working with the IGAD region and multiple countries within the IGAD region for country deep dives, cross-border deep dives, and city deep dives that are informed by the climate mobility hotspots in our data. Then on to Ambrose's question, the question on experience from the Karamoja cluster. Very interesting, yes. Those survey results are drawn from multiple case studies from across the continent, and they are not a representative or generalizable survey. They give us some broad brush indications that under certain circumstances, women were more reluctant than men to move. Of course, there are going to be many cases where there are dynamic, engaged, and climate literate women who are actively on the move and not necessarily held back by those broad brush generalizable vulnerabilities that apply to many women across the continent. That being said, we need a lot of research in that area to understand it more. And I think the point should be, we don't really need to understand the vulnerability point more. We need to understand how can we help reduce that vulnerability more as a means to harnessing climate mobility. Because it's well understood that women are more vulnerable to climate change than men, and women are more vulnerable when on the move than men. So your question on the link between migration and natural resources, yeah, interesting, and it's very difficult to project going forward how future changes, for example, in the mineral sector would affect where people are going to move, because if we haven't found those mineral discoveries, we can't add them into our climate mobility model. But what the model does reflect is a general spatial representation of Africa's rural and urban population. And for many countries, that rural and urban agglomeration model and its weighted gravity across different areas is very closely linked to Africa's natural resources, including mineral resources, particularly for African countries whose economies grew out of mineral endowment. For Rose's question, climate literacy for Africa, yeah, it might have been a little bit difficult to see in that map, but our data for Africa is national climate literacy rates average at 37.5% on the continent. So that's just over 1/3 of the population having heard of climate change and understand and attribute it to human causes, a very basic definition of climate literacy. It doesn't include assessment of people's deeper understanding of climate risk to their life or their business or their children's futures. All of that I would expect would drive climate literacy rates on the continent down if we used a more strict definition, but that's the definition based on the Afrobarometer survey, which was used to inform that statistic. That being said, for Uganda, there's a wide variety across different urban and rural areas, which is very much the case in all African countries. So in Arua, for example, climate literacy rates are 25%. For Kibale, climate literacy rates are around 50%. And some parts of Kampala over 70%. Just so there's quite a inequality and diversity in climate literacy rates, and you can think behind those to consider, well, women in those areas are likely to be less climate literate than men as well. On causes for moving, yes, it's very difficult to identify and segregate out the climate driver, particularly when doing large quantitative projections. But it is more feasible when you're looking at qualitative case study work, which are case studies across the continent did follow a pretty nuanced survey method where people were interviewed for the broadest possible range of reasons for why they stay or move. And across those different case studies, as I showed in the one figure, there was a diversity of reasons that people give. So as you rightly said, in instances where there is a rapid onset climate shock, such as floods or extreme heat, it seems to be a top of mind reason for why people move. But when we're talking about multi-year and even multi-generational trends of climate mobility, we need to factor in not just isolated events, but the cumulative effect of multiple small events that might erode the livelihood coping strategies, degrade a local environment, interrupt indigenous and local knowledge systems that have for generations afforded the opportunity of people to live sustainably in sight, but now are disrupted by climate change. All of that together is compounded and integrated with broader reasons, economic reasons, education reasons for why people might choose to move or stay. We also know that in Africa, there is a very common arrangement of co-location of livelihoods where people have one foot in the rural area and one foot in the urban area. And the reasons for that co-locality is complex and messy, and you can't just put it down to one or two factors. But in many cases, climate change will feature to a lesser or greater degree. And I think just to close on Rose's question, is a good way to think about it is to say climate change means everything change. Like climate change affects every part of society, every sector, and every level of governance. And therefore, if we think deep enough and long enough, you will find a climate signal behind the future of Africa's population movements. I think I'll stop there. I haven't been looking at questions in the chat, I'm afraid. But yeah, we're up to.
Nick, maybe you can just scan through. There are quite a number of questions. You could just scan through and reflect on them very fast.
Okay. Okay, so from Robert Kalisa, can you contextualize the link between mobility and these contexts, refugees, IDPs, pastoralism, nomadism, conflicts, like Chad, Niger, etc., urbanization, extractive mineral discoveries? I think I answered that question earlier. quite sufficiently when I was speaking to resource endowment. So I'll just jump. I see a question from Brille Anderson on is there a difference in openness to migrate between caregivers and non-caregivers? And that's a great question. I don't know. And I think that's a really good research question going forward. I don't think our survey included a focus on that, and I haven't seen any associated study on that. And I'd love to hear from anybody here if they have a good answer for that. I'll move on to Oscar. Is there any positive trend attributed to climate-induced mobility, and how can we leverage over the same for climate resilient development? So by positive trend there, I assume you're asking for positive outcomes rather than like the climate attribution trend terminology. And the answer is when climate mobility is anticipatory and in advance of severe climate shock, then yes, there's lots of evidence that moving can have a positive outcome for those that are on the move, but also for receiving communities. That the migrants landing in new contexts can add new labor resources, can add new skills, can add a diversity to the population that was previously missing, that can drive innovation and economic growth. But that is under the conditions of moving safely and being received well. So it's contingent on that feasibility criteria. The question from Gava, it's abundantly clear that the proportionality of greenhouse gas emissions to the index levels of climate change impacts is inverse, meaning the impacts due to greenhouse gas emissions is especially felt where it's least generated. How can we strike a consensus to bring about dialogue for inclusivity to get the most affected regions playing a significant role in developing and implementing the developed mitigation and adaptation measures against adverse effects? Yeah, great question. So if you've been following the processes around the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the whole purpose of that process is to develop and transform the current global economic and political system to better reflect the inequitable distribution of climate impacts and raise the necessary financial and technology resources to help address these challenges. Obviously, it's been a challenging process, and for decades, the scientific consensus on climate change and its impacts on African communities, particularly on the most vulnerable, has been known, and is just increasingly documented, while action to address both reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also providing adequate support, and that means finance and technology to support adaptation, has been insufficient, misaligned, and inaccessible to most African needs for adaptation. So we need significant progress at global UNFCCC level to move that needle. But part of our climate mobility deep dive process is to support African partners, whether they city governments or national governments or regional initiatives such as the IGAD Secretariat or the Sahel Climate Commission, to be able to include projections of climate mobility in their development planning processes, including national adaptation planning processes and national development plans. in order to better access climate finance that would be able to help anticipate and plan for climate mobility going forward. I see the question
Okay.
from Rhoda.
Nick,
Is a
anything more
similar
before
question. So, sorry, Caliste, over to you.
Patrick, we'll give you a chance. Nick, anything more? Comment on? No, yes, Patrick, I see your hand is up. We need to move forward. So, Patrick, you can raise your concern, comment, and we'll move forward.
Good afternoon and good morning everywhere where you are. I am Patrick from Field of Africa Rights Alliance, and we are concerned in enabling environment. My concern was basically on migrations, the migration that is now a particular aspect that is coming caused by environment. And I was asking myself that now that there are so many case scenarios that we are facing, for instance, in Kasese in Uganda, you know what is taking place with River Nyamwamba, and most of the people who are living along that side are moving. Another case scenario recently that took in place in Rwanda, and in Congo, they are alongside Lake Kivu, and so many people died. In Uvira also, and recently we were on the Earth Day, and we visited Luzira, Portobello areas. We saw how the impacts of climate change are ravaging that area where people are fishing and are sitting. Now, my question and my concern was, how is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is going to change their policies and the criteria in accepting those thousands of people that are migrating from displacement in their own countries, now that they are crossing over borders of where they are affected, and among the criteria, this criteria of climate change is not involved. What will be their take in this aspect when they receive, when people start moving from one border to another in search for places, and they come as migrants in terms of refugees, as far as their criteria are concerned? That was my concern.
Thanks, Patrick, and really good question, because the heart of your question is one of the core reasons why the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative started. Across the multilateral and UN system, there isn't a body that has been set with a specific mandate to provide protection in the case of climate mobility. And therefore, we are working with UNHCR, for example, in the IGAD region's climate change adaptation strategy, to develop new recognition and programs that would better provide protections for that kind of movement that you describe. I think also it's important to realize that in many cases, the majority of movement on the continent, like the overwhelming majority of movement on the continent, will be internal within African countries, so not cross-border. And there aren't protections currently at an international level that guarantee the safety of that kind of climate mobility. And therefore, it is of grave concern to us that we put climate mobility on the agenda of internal development and adaptation planning for African governments to recognize their own displacement, their own movement, and the vulnerabilities for their own populations as a result. Together with that, there is a growing international consensus on the need for protections for international movements, particularly for populations that might have historically crossed borders anyway, and live in borderlands. And we heard already from the Karamoja cluster across northwestern Kenya, northern Uganda, southern South Sudan, and southwestern Ethiopia. Populations across those regions have been able to move freely and should be able to move freely in response to their environmental needs for their livelihood. But there needs to be greater recognition and protections from, and you're correct in signaling out UNHCR, for those kinds of populations under chronic and increased climate change. Thank you.
Okay. So, probably maybe we need to move on into
Doctor,
the
you're not clear.
next,
Doctor, you're not clear. We can't get you.
Is running out. We started losing more people. Can you probably move to the next part of the presentation? That's okay. Anybody? Okay, I think I need to find a way.
Thanks, Dr. Kalis. I think you were breaking up a little bit there, but I'll just take it from there with the final part of the presentation, which should be about 12 minutes, giving an overview of the country deep dives, as well as our planned work with the government of Uganda for a Uganda country deep dive. The ACMI's core areas of work involve knowledge and data for impact, and that focuses on informing climate adaptation policy and practice. In this process of country and city and borderland deep dives, we will be localizing and downscaling the ACMI findings and synthesizing it with local research, knowledge, and policies for climate mobility. So the deep dives will contextualize the modeling findings from the first phase of the ACMI's work, focusing on future climate mobility hotspots that are projected to be either destinations or origins of climate mobility. Each deep dive will include the development and final publication of a climate mobility blueprint for anticipating and planning for climate mobility. It'll be informed by synthesis of country level findings of the ACMI model and analysis, with country specific review of policies and research, as well as consultations with key stakeholders. It aims to set a comprehensive adaptation agenda to anticipate and plan for climate mobility. It'll identify key geographies, population groups, and sectors affected by climate mobility, outline possible targeted interventions in the short, mid, and long terms, and recommendations for actors that need to be mobilized for sustained action. So the deep dives aim to advance comprehensive, people-centered and community-based solutions for climate mobility, and will firstly localize knowledge, develop national blueprints, and thirdly, develop a common agenda on climate mobility, including through support to national adaptation plans and adaptation components of nationally determined contributions. A deep dive will follow 3 main phases, and phase 1 will involve the mining of the ACMI data, as I already mentioned, and then step 2, a desk review of existing data and research. Step 1 and step 2 will be synthesized together to develop a draft report on the state of knowledge on climate mobility for that city, country, or region. Importantly, at phase 1, we are setting up a governance structure for the climate mobility deep dive that will be convened by the government of the country or city that we're working with and the Global Center for Climate Mobility. But we will also be drawing on and forming a technical advisory group. The technical advisory group will be a group of experts and entities that have insights, data, and specific knowledge necessary for anticipating and planning for climate mobility. The technical advisory group will be drawn from quite a broad range of society and stakeholders, from government, research, as well as the UN system, to draw on the latest data and knowledge on the topic. Phase 2 involves, is this in the way? Sorry. Phase 2 involves a consultation phase, where the knowledge that has been generated and synthesized out of phase 1 will be shared through consultation with national and subnational partners, local stakeholders, in the validation and the deepening of our understanding of climate mobility hotspots. And that will involve the design and implementation of a consultation process with relevant stakeholders. And we are glad, in the case of Uganda, to be working with Mr. Fred Onduri as the Global Center for Climate Mobility's consultant in Uganda. He has served in multiple positions in the government of Uganda, including ministries of internal and foreign affairs, as well as through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where he has served as the chair of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, amongst multiple other highly relevant positions. And through that consultation phase, myself and Mr. Fred Nduri will aim to work with a broad range of stakeholders in Uganda to consult, validate, downscale all the knowledge that we have on climate mobility in order, in phase 3, to develop a climate mobility blueprint for Uganda. This blueprint aims to address and harness climate mobility with strong and concrete recommendations for the governance, actors, and sectors that need to be included in planning for this kind of adaptation. But importantly, it also involves, through our UN and multilateral networks, the mobilization of international, national, and local support for the implementation of those blueprints, including aspects of adaptation finance In advance of the Uganda climate mobility deep dive, we have already been working very hard with our consulting partners at Columbia University to develop the mining of the ACMI data over the last 5 months. And we have some preliminary projections for Uganda. But just to say, we also intend to do deep dives with multiple other countries and cities on the continent, including Niger, Somalia, Angola, Comoros, possibly Cote d'Ivoire, Botswana, as well as the city of Cape Town, the cities of Beira and Freetown, and maybe 1 or 2 others. We'll be doing a borderland deep dive in the IGAD region, possibly even in the Karamoja cluster, and another borderland deep dive in the Sahel region, possibly on the border between Niger and Nigeria. So, that's an overview of our deep dive process, what we're planning to do, and yeah, I'd like to invite any questions around that going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Do you hear me, Nick?
Yes, I do.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I already see some comments in the chat. Maybe you can check participants on any comment on this part, the country deep dive, or any other parts we have been talking about. So maybe you respond to those comments already in the chat, Nick, before we move on.
Okay, thank you. I'll just try catch up with the chat. 1 second. Okay, so
opportunities for research.
Yes, I see that. A question from Jane: does the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative support research? If so, how can one be involved? Thank you for that question. At the moment, the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative has invested significantly in the research that developed the African Shifts report. So it invested in qualitative case study research across multiple sites on the continent, as well as invested in the state-of-the-art modeling of future climate mobility with our partners at Columbia University in New York. We have therefore developed a body of knowledge that is vast, and our primary objective on the research side for the next 2 years is the dissemination of that knowledge for action. Because we believe it's critically important that policy actors are shared that information, and we help them interpret it for their context as well as possible. Understanding how much climate and migration research just sits in the peer-reviewed or report-related literature, our big focus is to translate research into practice for the next 2 years. That being said, as we conduct these deep dives, we will likely find areas, research questions arising that require the commissioning of short research projects to answer very deep, specific questions. And in that case, the ACMI might have some funding for some short-term research. But yeah, just to say, our big investment in research has been over the last 2 years, and our commitment to African governments is to translate that research rather than generating much more new research going forward. But to be involved, we have created what's called the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative Research Network, which I would like to share with this group. I'll pop a link to the email address in the chat just now, and you can engage through that network on research themes that the ACMI might be involved in, but also researchers more broadly on the continent that are doing research on climate mobility that ACMI is not necessarily funding, but promoting. So I'll move on to another question. Are there any provisions for research in these areas? I just answered that. The same question from Gava. From Rose, I'm just wondering how the ACMI work will integrate the work on the Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change. At a policy level, every country, city or regional deep dive will have consideration of the Kampala Declaration and consider its implications for their domain of interest and responsibility. Then from Oscar, what is your communication and report strategy given the current information dissemination gaps in the world of research today? Yeah, Oscar, great question. And our strategy has been pretty robust, to be honest. So it goes beyond the publication of a report. Our report is almost 300 pages long. We recognize that not everybody's going to read that report, but what we have done is we have also provided that report in the form of short storylines on our website. And just last year, our website won the Webby Award for Sustainability and Environment because of how effectively it communicates climate mobility. For those that don't know, the Webby Awards are the global awards for the best websites out there. So we invested quite a lot of time in our website, both in order to tell the story of climate mobility, the lived realities of climate mobility that people face, but also we share our data, our results and our projections for climate mobility on the website, so people can interrogate it for themselves, zoom down to their specific location, and be able to see what climate mobility projections there are for where you live. And so I'll just post in the chat now the link to this website that'll have a lot of our information communication embedded in there. You'll also see that on the website we provide pages called Voices from the Front Lines, so that tells multiple storylines of climate mobility. But we have a tab for exploring our data where you can dig down and have a look for yourself. We've got a picture and video gallery that helps communicate climate mobility to people that are more visually stimulated than necessarily a report. And then we've also got a key messages flyer, which is a fact sheet summarizing all the big numbers of the report just in a couple pages. So yeah, we've invested significantly in information dissemination, given how important it is to us that this is communicated widely and effectively with the broadest range of possible stakeholders. Maybe I'll take one question from Elizabeth in the chat before going to John Mary, whose hand is up. So National Planning Authority, our responsibility is planning, evaluating, and policy decision making. How can we be part of this climate mobility? Currently, we've made sure climate change is streamlined in all national programs. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, great question. We would love to have all government stakeholders involved in the deep dive process. So the overlaps between adaptation planning for climate mobility and development planning are significant, and there's co-benefits between progress in both of those spaces for each other. And so we will be, through Dr. Caliste, certainly following up with you and the National Planning Authority and inviting you onto our technical advisory group so that the National Planning Authority can be involved in both the framing of the questions that we're asking in the deep dive, as well as the framing of the implementation actions and actors and stakeholders that should be involved in making the blueprints a reality. So yeah, thank you. Then yeah, so I see two people have had their hands up, so I think I'll stop reading from the chat and we can just go to John and Sobe Chukwu maybe.
All right. Thank you.
Ahead, John.
Okay, thank you so much. When I listen to you, it sounds like we have resigned to the effects of the climate, the impact, and so on. So we are concluding that the mobility must be there. But I know that there are many efforts that I think are being done to try and see that perhaps the climate change effects are sort of either reversed or controlled. The NDCs with the ambitions, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, I think there are many efforts that are working towards that. I think I'm also, if I remember very well, there should be a project that is working on reducing the desertification, the deserts in Africa. I think there's a project of either putting forests across all those areas that are arid in Africa. So I don't know whether that could also help in sort of controlling the mobility. Because as I said, we are going to experience terrible civil wars, terrible, violence because of the resources. I realized, like, for example, in Uganda, I think many people seem to be moving towards where the rivers are and the lakes are. And I think already we are realizing that Uganda is getting full, and I think many other areas with the good soils and good, environment. And so I feel the extent of confusion and fights and will be too much. So I don't know whether those efforts that the globe is already working on, whether they'll be able to support and sort of reduce the mobility. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, John Mary. And we call it Major, you come in.
Okay, yeah. Good morning from here. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Nick. This is quite impressive and is.
Can you introduce yourself so that you know where you are calling from, if you don't mind?
Okay, Sobe Chukwu Ifemeje, working with Deltares in the Netherlands and also with United Nations University in Maastricht, still in the Netherlands, and currently working on research on Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. Thank you so much. My focus of my question is actually on the phase 2 of the consultations, and with few researches I've done in Nigeria, Ghana, and part of Uganda, I noticed a little bit of bottleneck with government policies, especially when it has to do with land tenure system. Why I'm saying this is particularly on the ACMI is focused on human-centered mitigation, resilience, and adaptation. When there are natural, maybe environmental disasters, we notice there are different scenarios being played from the national government to the state government. I'll use Nigeria for instance. In the land issues, Nigeria is made up of 36 states with 6 geopolitical regions. Most regions handle the land tenure system differently. So you notice one region could have effective implementation of settling those who are being displaced, by while another region is actually battling with it. And this is actually aggravating high level of conflict and violence within some regions, because their host community who are receiving those who are being displaced because of climate-related issues later in future run into mental health challenges. Some are being forcibly displaced from being the host because of scarce resources that are being shared. From your experience, Dr. Nick, have you been able to have a quick discussion in this level of governance, how they are going to attend to them internally? Because by interview, most people who are on the move may not quietly spell to you that I'm being moved because of climate change. But when you look through the Foresight 2011 publication, you notice that climate change effects are often a trigger to the main cause of why people move, both political, economic, demographic, whatever you could name it. But climate change has a way it overlays the tipping point why people move. So from your consultations and research, has this area been considered? Because we have a national law, we have most of them spelled out in blue and black, but in the terms of having it to implemented and the national development plans, we're not seeing it. And then the second question is nature-based solutions also part of it? Because one of the things that causes perhaps something like flooding in most urban cities is development. Yes, when the lands are getting paved, we have limited number of portions where filtrations can occur. We saw a part of this mostly urban areas like Lagos, for instance. 20 years ago, it wasn't getting flooded as it used to be, but it's getting industrialized, it's getting developed. But from our research, little is being attached to nature-based solutions. So from your overview, what are the areas you think this position and work should do for government to handle this aspect? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nick, maybe you can respond to those and also a few in the chat, and then we see how we are doing with the time. Over to you, Nick.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Khalid. So, John Mary, your question about, is it a little bit fatalistic for us to frame the projections of climate mobility around an RCP 6.0 or high emissions future, and what about all the really good action that's going on at the moment, and how can we harness that to inspire us to effective adaptation to climate change? So just to clarify, our big message from the African Shifts report and our agenda for action going into the deep dives is, yes, let's harness all possible action. Let's take on a high road future where we take responsibility and agency over our adaptation future. But it's important to realize that we can't conflate climate action in the adaptation space with climate action in the mitigation space. Because in the mitigation space, Africa contributes less than 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So any change in Africa's greenhouse gas emissions over the next 10 to 30 years is likely to have very negligible effect on increased global warming, particularly given current policies and trajectories that we know of. So what do we have agency over? We have agency over our development planning and our adaptation planning, and particularly for adaptation planning in how we reduce vulnerability on the continent. All of those can be addressed in the near term, like 5-year, 10-year development goals and action. And so if you have a look at our agenda for action, that's much more fleshed out than just the 8 little bullet points that I presented today, you'll see that they integrate active and very specific adaptation planning aspects with development planning for the future in as positive a possible way, trying to bring back agency on climate action to Africa. But we've got to be realistic. We got to know that there's things that we've got very little agency over at the moment. So we don't want to ignore that. We've got to be honest. Just a point on the Great Green Wall. It's a fantastic initiative that many governments are behind, but it's also important to recognize that we need to prioritize the restoration of Africa's ecosystems as they have existed, rather than transforming them necessarily to a new ecosystem that might not fit. For example, the Great Green Wall, while it might have benefits in some areas to increase the number of trees and shade, if it's done in an inappropriate way, it could also reduce the biodiversity and reduce groundwater for existing populations that are there, because those trees would use more water than the natural savanna land that they're being planted in many parts of the continent. That also presents a risk to biodiversity and a risk to future wildfire. So where we're doing these adaptation responses, they need to be very cognizant of what appropriate ecosystem-based adaptation for those environments would need. Otherwise, we risk maladaptation and ending up putting ourselves in a worse situation than when we started. All the while, climate change is increasing. Then on to the two questions around governance and nature-based solutions. Yes, we're going to put a big attention on the importance of multi-level and cooperative governance. There is a growing understanding in the scientific climate change and migration literatures that multi-level governance is critically important. We understand that in Africa, institutional and governance dimensions are two of the most common, not always, but very common constraints on the feasibility of migration as a form of adaptation. But when institutional and governance arrangements are in place, there's a much higher chance that migration or mobility can be positive as a net outcome for those on the move. So we will be emphasizing that in a big way. On your second point on cities and nature-based solutions, yes, the way we frame it is people positive and nature positive climate change adaptation. They have to come together for it to be effective, because we know across the continent, livelihoods are intimately connected with their local ecosystem. And because of that, healthy and functioning ecosystems provide the kinds of goods and services that enable people to move safely or stay and build resilience where they are. So our agenda on ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions is going to primarily focus on supporting resilience building for people that need to stay, but also for cities and city planning going forward. Nature-based solutions for cooling areas, for example, in cities that will face extreme heat as temperatures increase and the urban heat island exacerbates those extreme heat conditions. Great. Let me have a look. I think we've probably come to the end of our time now.
Something in the chat, maybe you can check in the chat, Nick.
Okay, yeah, I'm just looking. Okay, so there's one question not answered yet from Robert, who's a hydrologist from Uganda. And his question is, in the study, has there been any specific linkage between climate mobility and water resources management? Really good question, because that speaks to governance going forward. For our projections of climate mobility going forward, the governance and management component of any resource is not included. So the model of climate mobility looks at the physical impacts of climate change on key sectors that we know are sectors that affect people's decisions to move or stay. So climate impacts on crops, for example, changes in drought, changes in flooding, changes in heavy precipitation and sea level rise. But we don't include in that projection future improvements or degrading of the management arrangements or the governance arrangements of those resources. And so you raise a really good question, that if we improve our water resource management, there is great potential to improve adaptation to climate impacts in the water sector. And that will have significant impact on reducing our projections of climate mobility going forward. Yeah, wonderful question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. We are running out of time. Is there any final comments from anybody before we end? I think, Nick, we have kept you working for some time, and we want to appreciate your time. I think this is time to bring this webinar to an end. Here online to join me. Thank you, Nick, for the and also a very elaborate response how the country deep dive, so that people who are on this line now are able to participate actively in the study. We already got some those that would want to be part. I think there will be many opportunities, as you have highlighted, for participation. Some of them will provide information, others will really be part of the different governance structures. And this has been the purpose of this webinar, to introduce this subject so that we can actually know issues related to climate mobility and how we can address these things that can be done to help address this, improve availability and solutions, again, measures to adapt impacts of climate change. So we can mitigate impacts of climate change and by implications. So I think the deep dive will enable us to address some of those issues as we discussed. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for sparing time to be with us for the last 2 hours. We thank Nick Mobility for considering Uganda to be part of this program. We look forward to working with you over the next few months to go deep into this topic. And I think the introduction is in that those who are not here with us when we started, this month webinars ahead every last Friday of the month, and our next webinar will be taking place on the 30th of June. So those of you who would want to be part of it, take a note of on who actually is going to be our next speaker and the topic. And I want call upon everybody, any of you would want to share the work you are doing. Reach out to the Secretariat using the contacts that you got so that you can share with you, so that you can actually benefit from the work you are doing as a way of knowledge sharing and also as a way of improving our capacity and resources available to us. I want to thank the Secretariat, the Water Resources Institute team, Francis, Member, and the team for organizing this event. Again, I want to thank all of you for making it happen. We wish you a nice weekend until we meet again on 30th June for the next webinar. Thank you very much and a nice day to all of you. We bring this webinar to close. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.